The youth who were killed in this bombing went shopping for clothes. We cannot rejoice this Eid.
Welcome back. Saudi Arabia isn't the only country bombed in recent days. Baghdad saw its deadliest bombings, killing hundreds of people. The current conflict in Iraq is a remnant of the invasion and war that left the country torn and gave rise to ISIL. A long-awaited British report out this week claims the run-up to that war included faulty intelligence and mismanagement. It claims countries like the US and the UK invaded on that flawed intelligence with no post-invasion strategy. Joining us for this portion of the show, Wajahat Ali is creative director of Affinis Labs and a writer and journalist, and Manal Omar is associate vice president for the Middle East and Africa Center at the United States Institute of Peace. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Wajahat, let me start with you. So we have this report produced by the British, the so-called Chilcot Report. It's a pretty devastating indictment against British Prime Minister Tony Blair. And we look at the headlines of the report. It found that the war was unnecessary but not illegal. The war was not a last resort, and that WMD was certainly not justified. Now, of course, we've heard all of this many times before. But what impact will this report have, seeing that it's coming from a government-appointed commission?
I mean, one would hope that the impact would allow us to look back on the decisions that were made by the UK and US. Like you said, I mean, it's really damning. Tony Blair deliberately inflated and exaggerated the threat that Saddam Hussein posed. I think a special memo that came out said the special relationship between Blair and Bush 7 months before the decision to invade said, I'm with you regardless, no matter what. This type of unconditional support between two superpowers to preemptively invade a country and then think somehow, due to Western military invasion, democracy would bloom across the Middle East and Muslims would embrace freedom and values of liberty and deodorant and whatnot. You know, I do dark humor sometimes just for the sake of catharsis, but we can look back on this and say, told you so, or my bad. But looking forward, what we have here is Iraq. Still, what happened just last week? 250 people died in Baghdad. Libya, civil war, crisis, ISIL's there. Syria, 5 years on, you have 11 million displaced people. You have 300,000 people dead. So can we look at the mistakes that we made, brilliant mistakes that we made, and make sure that we don't repeat them in Syria, Iraq, and Libya?
Right, Manal, and looking at the impact of a report like this, there is a former British diplomat writing in an American newspaper who says that, you know, reports like these, inquiries like these, have an ulterior motive. They're there to reassure the public, in this case the British public, that we recognize our mistakes and we're going to correct them right now. But what really happens is that, you know, we'll table this, it goes into a shelf and it collects dust, 6,000 pages. It's a giant waste of trees. I mean, there's nothing about accountability, about an apology, about reparations.
Well, that's where activists come into play, right? Because if you take this document, as you mentioned, activists and people who've been on the ground, who do conflict resolution, who do development, have been saying a lot of the findings, but they don't have the same legitimacy or the moral authority that an official UK government would have, who was also part of the coalition. So this isn't some type of government that refused to participate. It's actually someone who was part of the coalition, who stood by the US, who sent in forces. And so that acknowledgement, if activists choose to, could be something that you use as an advocacy tool that you would really be able to put onto the governments that you're working with and to the agencies to say, we want things to be done differently. And I emphasize the word differently because the danger is, and I think it's really relevant that this report came out as we're facing the world's largest refugee crisis, which was created as a result of inaction in Syria. So you have a real challenge. You know, action in Iraq destabilized the region. It really created this vacuum of power, gave rise to ISIS. But look at what inaction in Syria has done, and the rise of the refugee crisis, which has completely destabilized Europe, if not the world. We're no longer talking about a crisis in the Middle East. We're truly talking about a global crisis from the Middle East. And so how do we respond? How do we find it? And the challenge is it's been an all-in Iraq, Afghanistan style of invasion, or nothing. And what we need to do, and I think particularly people who are dedicated towards this field, is build out that spectrum of options in the middle and to say, what do we do? And look at Iraq, but also look at Libya. Remember, it was supposed to be the light footprint. But as Waj pointed out, it is, you know, major civil war and now one of the strongholds of ISIS, and probably why ISIS will survive, because they're shrinking in Iraq and Syria. But they have Libya and the Sahel to kind of fall back on.
Well, the report does to some extent mention the fact that there was no post-invasion strategy on the part of the United Kingdom or on the part of the United States. But let's look at the question of accountability. The report was very careful to say that, yes, there might have been faulty intelligence, the claims of WMD may have been exaggerated when we went to war, but it was not an illegal war. And in fact, what it said was that the legality of the war should be left up to an internationally appointed commission, some kind of legal inquiry that goes into that. But will anyone ever be held legally accountable for this?
Perhaps not. And I think that was actually another damning aspect of the report, because they didn't have the jurisdiction to make any legal claims. But they did say in that report that an independent legal commission should be set up to actually check whether or not this war was in fact legal.
So the jury's still out on that,
Yeah, jury's
right?
still out. And also we're talking about what we can learn from this war. And Manal just said we're talking about Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and of course we're going to have war-hungry powers. You know, does the United States and does the UK actually have the legal authority, if you will, to commit these airstrikes? If Hillary Clinton is elected president, or Donald Trump, apparently we're going to be banned from coming to America. But, you know, Hillary Clinton, she says she wants to be much more aggressive in the Middle East. She wants to be much more aggressive in Syria and Libya. Well, does she have the authority, the legal authority given to her to actually even do airstrikes, put special troops on the ground? That in itself, I think, is very important, and specifically if you want to look at prosecutions, which there will be no prosecutions. But, you know, it's one thing just to tap someone on the wrist and say, you're bad, Tony Blair. But if you want to ensure that there's good behavior, you need actually criminal prosecutions. You need people indicted. You need people in jail. You need some sort of metric there to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And based on what you've said, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe I'm a cynic, but maybe I'm a realist also.
And I think that there's, I mean, whereas I can completely appreciate, I'm always a person who emphasizes accountability, there is a potential moral hazard. And we need to look at the overarching, and particularly what was called on in Libya, but the responsibility to protect. I mean, no one talked about that in terms of Iraq, but these were dictators that were doing horrendous crimes in their communities. And people were sitting by and watching. I would add maybe making money off of it under sanctions, under, you know, authoritarian regimes. And so there does come this question of responsibility to protect. And the more we talk about accountability in the legal, it may actually de-incentivize countries who can actually put a stop to mass atrocities like we saw in Boston or Rwanda. You know, everyone may just step back and say, we're going to be non-interventionist, and that doesn't work either. Again, inaction and things. So that real balance, I think, needs to be.
Yeah, but it does seem in this case that the motivation behind the war changed. I mean, we were told initially that it was about WMD, and then it became about regime change.
Well, I think what we're missing from the Iraq and Afghanistan model, and it's something that I continuously try to push on, is what is the new role of the UN as the world has changed? Because that was unilateral moves, it was bilateral agreements, and the UN was almost, you know, on the sidelines and forced into this war. And again, same in the inaction. So what is the role of the UN? Where is the muscle of the Security Council? I mean, since, you know, high school we've been debating this. I was going to say, since high school we've been debating this. Since the 60s we've been talking about the reform. But we don't truly have a unilateral institute to lead these efforts. And so it continues to fall on the shoulders of the US and the UK. And frankly, both populations don't have the appetite for it anymore.
Well, speaking about responsibility, if you have an international community that is consistently sidestepped by the most powerful, jacked up member, United States and UK, then what does it matter, right? It's completely impotent and irrelevant.
If you listen to what Tony Blair said, you know, when this report came out, he said, look, I accept these serious criticisms, that's what he said, but I would do it again.
Because God told him to do it, so of course he has to.
I mean, how do you think the families of people who were killed in that war, British service people who were killed in that war, the families of people who were seriously injured in the war, how will they respond to that kind of statement? I would do it again.
Tears, frustration, anger, but at the same time, as we've seen time and time again throughout human history, those who are in power are allowed to, if you will, humiliate those who are powerless and get away with it. But go ahead.
Yeah, but I would also just say that, you know, one of the things that surprised me the most is, you know, I wrote a book about my time in Iraq, and I spent a lot of time in war zones. The people who end up emailing me the most are not people from the region, or not people from the Muslim communities. It's families of soldiers who are desperate for reason. And I'll never forget this young girl from Texas who wrote to me and said, I'd like to think my father is one of the soldiers that helped you out there. So in terms of I would do it again, I think it's really difficult for families of soldiers to say this was just a mistake and people died because of making money. They still hold on to the belief that it had positive change. And in some cases it did. I mean, again, we cannot ignore the mass atrocities that were taking place in the region.
Right. Positive change. Wajahat, let's look at this. I mean, the one metric to look at the success or failure of this war. We were told before the war that Saddam Hussein was posing a threat, not just to the Middle East, but he was posing a threat to the world, that he had WMD, etc. We were told that if he was removed, it would make the world a safer place. Is it?
No. Look, we didn't intervene when Saddam Hussein chemically gassed his own people, when he was a tyrannical dictator, when he oppressed the Shia majority, when he rooted out dissent. That was perfectly fine. Donald Rumsfeld shook his hand. And now Saddam Hussein, horrible dictator, everyone will agree, is gone. But what happened? We invaded. We had no strategy. Paul Brenner made a catastrophic mistake by the de-Baathification, right? Security forces are gone. You have what? Power instability. You have a vacuum. What rises? ISIS rises. Right. So much so that Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian thug at that time, said, Al-Qaeda's weak. Thank you, United States, for this invasion because it helps strengthen Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda more so than ISIS. ISIS is now in what? Syria and Libya. And like we've seen this past week.
It was Colin Powell, wasn't it, in that speech at the UN who put Zarqawi on the pedestal and said, this is...
Well, I mean, there is apparently also a uranium cake from Niger, and there's also, what else was there? Anthrax. I mean, and look at Colin Powell. And we were just talking about this outside. We remember that speech he gave, and there was just a look of sadness and frustration, because he knew then, as he knows now, and he's more vocal about it, that he was selling a false story to go into a war that he knew at that time he didn't need to go into.
Right,
and at this day and age, you have 150,000 people are killed. This situation is less safe. You have sectarian conflict, and now we're seeing in Medina, Indonesia, Baghdad, United States, you see the fire and the poison that's spreading.
You know, it looks like when we look at this, it seems that the United Kingdom followed the United States into war in Iraq. In that sense, was Tony Blair bullied by George Bush?
I think it's hard to say in terms of where the pressure came from. I mean, when, we remember those days really thinking Tony Blair would be a different voice and have a different sound, and it didn't come out. And who was able to influence who? I think it's hard to say whether it was fully bullied. I think the challenge, and again, when I was on the ground, was you felt very strongly the reluctance of the UK officials that were there. I mean, you had, for example, and someone that I admire greatly, Ambassador Jeremy Greenstock, who was on the ground and who was the person running and really was pushing for Iraq. But, one of the things, kind of the cognitive dissonance, was sitting with someone as great as Ambassador Greenstock and saying, how can you be promoting this war? Right. And we know now that individually they were all against it, and it was more of a policy. And a lot of great politicians were put, or career diplomats were put in a position that they didn't necessarily agree with. And I think that's part of the failure, was you actually had a lot of people who were not convinced. It wasn't just not having a strategy, it was having multiple strategies. And in Baghdad, it was palpable. You felt the divide between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. I mean, we were, oftentimes negotiating just between the agencies, let alone between the Iraqi government, because it was so divided and there were so many disagreements. And so in that sense, I think it wasn't only Blair and Bush, it was all throughout, middle management, high, all representations were on different pages, and that's one of the primary reasons why we failed. We were constantly shifting plans. It was shifting sands.
I think the report was damning. I think the report was damning also because Blair wasn't bullied, and there's an Urdu word I want to throw here. He was a chamcha. He was a spoon and a tool.
Well, they called him a poodle, didn't they?
Yeah, a poodle. And even like you said, in the memo, it said again and again, and I think one of the very damning things of the report, it says UK does not have to be an unconditional friend of the United States, number one, just to be an ally, and number two, Blair had zero influence over Bush and the post-invasion strategy.
Right. One of the conclusions of the report was that there would be no UK-US relations would not have suffered if the UK did not get into the war. We're going to have to leave it there. Wajahat, Ali, Manal, Omar, thanks to both of you for joining us.